Hello and welcome to the Stormont Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Stormont and inside policymaking across Northern Ireland. I'm David McCann, and also on the podcast are our two regulars. We have Michael McKernan. He was former special advisor to the SDLP from 2007 to 2016. Hello, Michael.
Hello, David.
There we are. And also our other regular, we have Tim Cairns. He was former special advisor to DUP First Minister Peter Robinson. Hello, Tim.
Hello, Michael. Hello, David.
There we are,
Hello,
just
Tim.
reversing the order there.
Now, David is a bad man, because we had a little thing going. We had to do a retake, and David's completely thrown us. Actually, well done, David.
Well done. There you go. See, thinking on my feet, unlike you. Okay, on the podcast today, we are looking at whether the political temperature at Stormont is going to lead to the collapse of the executive. This week, the mood in the Assembly was grim, with arguments and barbs about the Education Minister and the DUP's non-attendance at the presidential inauguration of Catherine Connolly dominating the headlines. We're asking if a collapse is inevitable, or can we turn the heat down on our politics? We're also going to be taking some listener questions, so all that and more coming up on this episode of Stormont Sources. Okay, we haven't done this for a wee while. Listeners' questions. Apologies to our faithful listeners who are sending in questions every week, and it's just my bad timekeeping that means that we haven't been able to actually get to them. So we thought, with a bit of a lull in the political debate this week, we would make some time to go through some of the listeners' questions. And we're going to go to our first question from Andrew. Andrew says this: Hi, David, Michael, Tim. There has been long talk of two unionist parties. The most obvious path for me is a DUP-UUP merger. Could you spend some time on the podcast gaming this out? Would talks be in secret? Who would be involved? Who would moderate? What would it be? The new name, and who would lead it? We have kind of talked a little bit about this before, and I'm going to go to you first as our resident unionist on this panel, Tim. I think you've been involved in kind of moderating talks and go-betweens between unionist parties.
I was just thinking about that story. I mean, for people who don't know, at the time when Edwin Poots won the leadership of the DUP, there was a story emerged. I don't know who got it. I think it was Jim McCormick in the BBC who got it, where Doug Beattie and Jeffrey Donaldson at that time, who had lost the leadership election, had been in secret talks for perhaps maybe Jeffrey jumping ship to the Ulster Unionist Party, or what it would look like for a portion of the DUP jumping ship. Now, both men denied that the talks were anything to do with that, but there's this rumour started in the BBC that I was the person who had facilitated those talks. I don't know how this rumour started. It's not true. I was as surprised when the story was broken on the BBC as anybody else. But I think in terms of any serious negotiations for any kind of realignment or merger, that's about as close as it ever came. And those really weren't serious talks at that point in time. There's nobody has ever seriously put forward a case or a way in which unionists could come together and the DUP and the UUP could merge. My personal view, I agree with Andrew. I do think that unionism would be in a better place if the DUP and the UUP were, at the very least, to start formal cooperation. Now, I don't think either party is in a position to do that. Certainly the UUP don't feel that the time is right to do that. The UUP still feel that there's growth there. They feel they can eat into the DUP's vote share. So we had Robbie Butler on a couple of weeks ago, and that's certainly Robbie's position. Robbie would be very clear there. This is not the right time. Yeah. His view is it's never going to be the right time. There's a place for the Ulster Unionist Party, and he said that was a conscience of unionism.
John Tong's membership survey of the UUP finds the membership are really not in favour of merging with the DUP. Naturally, so why would you join the UUP if you want to merge with the DUP? But there's a very traditional
feeling behind that, where there's this kind of, and we've talked about this before, where there are UUP members who just absolutely, they would hold exactly the same views as maybe someone like, a Paul Given or an Edwin Poots within the DUP. That would be their natural kind of inclination. But they so hate the DUP because of historical reasons, where Paisley was seen as coming in and taking the DUP's clothes and, sniping at taking the UUP's clothes, sniping at the UUP to get votes and creating crisis amongst unionism, that they hate that so much that just runs deep, even within families, within unionists, that people just wouldn't vote DUP or wouldn't want to be part of it. So whilst that feeling exists within a significant number of UUP members, it feels unlikely. And whilst elected representatives, and I know John Burrows feels this, Robbie Butler feels this, every single UUP MLA feels this, and councillor as well. They think there is growth for the UUP. I disagree with them, and I think it would be best for the parties to at least start formal cooperation. I think that would definitely be better for unionism, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in the short term or medium term.
I'll come to you, Michael, on this. The other problem I have with kind of a realignment within unionism is that you can't just add the votes of the two of them together and think you're going to get that there. There's a progressive wing of the UUP who probably would not be totally comfortable going in with the DUP as well. Michael, what do you think about this? I mean, this has been talked about for a while. I mean, we're coming up to the 40th anniversary of the Anglo-Irish agreements this month, and that was the last time we had major pan-unionist cooperation trying to defeat that, and that was that was not very effective.
Yeah, I think. Well, firstly, thanks for the question, Andrew. When it comes to unionism, I'm something of an innocent, but my own view is that there were some discussions, maybe not about the two parties joining, but I think it was a genuine fact that at the time Jeffrey Donaldson did have a chat with Doug Beattie about joining the Ulster Unionist Party. Doug Beattie said that, and I have no reason to disbelieve him. I had looked at this and I had thought, yes, because Mike Nesbitt and Doug Beattie and others had tried to lead the Ulster Unionist Party into a distinctively more liberal unionist territory and found that their party wouldn't go with them, I thought, well, if they're not liberal unionists, I was falling into the trap of Tim's analysis, which was, what the heck are they for then? If they're, they might as well be part of the DUP, etc. What do they exist for? But I'll give Robbie Butler credit. He came onto the pod and he said, we're not liberals. That's a mistake to think that we are. We're as staunch on the union as the DUP or anyone else. But we are unionists with a greater social conscience. And that was his offering. And he illustrated that, for example, they didn't go on the Israel trip. Well, sorry, Steve Aiken did, but Robbie Butler and others turned it down, Doug Beattie. They were remarkable on integrated education, because when it came to the crunch on that bill, and the majority mood in the Assembly was to pass it, even though the Ulster Unionists had voted against it, Doug refused to join a DUP petition of concern, which could have sunk the legislation completely, and he stood out and wouldn't allow any of his MLAs to do that. And then, of course, on Brexit, they were against Brexit. They didn't think it was Northern Ireland's interest and the interests of ordinary people. So I do see a distinction there. And then when you look at the latest numbers, I know these numbers move about and there's margins of error, but the DUP was on 18, the Ulster Unionists were on 12, and that's not insignificant. If you're sitting on 12%, you're only a couple of percent away from making an electoral breakthrough. So I don't see it happening, and I don't think it's just a sort of pettiness or a snobbery or something in the Ulster Unionists that they won't have anything to do with the DUP. I think there is a sort of slightly different mindset. And also then there's no real reason for the DUP to do it, because if they joined up with the Ulster Unionists, that would soften their image inevitably in some way or other, and that would provide more open ground for TUV, who are just totally uncompromising on everything.
And we saw a divide, obviously, this week with the UUP, and we'll get into this a wee bit later, but the UUP went to the inauguration of Catherine Connolly as President of Ireland. The DUP didn't.
I was going to say the opposite, David. We actually saw this week unionist cooperation. I mean, if you watch the Assembly debate on Monday, the speeches that Robbie Butler gave, or John Burrows gave, or other unionists gave, were all indistinguishable from each other. Unionism was absolutely rock solidly united on Monday. And a couple of people have commented to me just in the last couple of days, why couldn't it be like that all the time?
Well, Tim,
why couldn't it be that the unionists are very much united in that way?
Just let me jump in, because Gabriel, by the way, took exception to something you said on a previous podcast. And by the way, if you take exception with Tim, that gets you to the head of the line, by the way. So that's a good sight. So Gabriel, he's actually sent a very thoughtful comment, which isn't too long, so it kind of ticks all the boxes, right? Hello. Let me say I'm enjoying the podcast very much. Your production has been refreshingly balanced. Deep dive into some of the often messy facets of Northern Ireland politics. Thank you for that, Gabriel. I'd like to draw on Tim's comments on the future of the UUP and what its purpose is in the 21st century. I think he's missed the mark on emphasising the current irrelevance, or that they are a listing ship. Indeed, while the leadership has had some frenetic change recently, their tack to a more moderate progressive unionist party does not belie a sense of purpose or political home for voters, many of whom would not feel comfortable with the DUP or the TUV. As a Catholic and a very much non-voting American, it has been refreshing to see an inclusive Unionist party that can adapt outside of core PL communities. And I might challenge him to explain what the purpose of the TUV is if the DUP represents core Unionist policy. I'd wager that few spads would have predicted that the cult of Allister would have swelled to become the current threat to the DUP flanks that it is today, only a few short years ago. In any case, I look forward to tuning in regularly for these discussions and wish you all the best for future episodes. Thanks for that, Gabriel. But he does have a point. I suppose
he's asked that question of the wrong person, actually. So, because when Jim Allister first emerged back into politics, I was working in the policy unit of the DUP.
So for context, this is back in 2004, European elections.
2004.
Jim Allister had departed the DUP in the 80s and had been out of the party for well over 10 years.
He's going to be a very successful barrister, QC, a very, very successful barrister at the criminal bar. And it was the DUP had done remarkably well in the elections in 2003. And then just after that, they were looking for a candidate for the European election. Everybody thought it was going to be Nigel Dodds. But the European Parliament changed the rules, so you couldn't be a member of the National Parliament and the European Parliament, so the DUP were left scrabbling about who's it going to be. And Jim Allister was approached, and Jim Allister said he would come back into politics. I remember sitting in the policy unit of the DUP. It was myself. I'll not name the names of the other people who were in the policy unit at the time, but they were sitting there. Some of them are well known, some of them aren't. And Peter Robinson was there as well. And everybody was like the cat who got the cream. They were all, this is amazing. We brought Jim. It was everybody's cock-a-hoop, practically high-five time.
Why was that, Tim? Because Jim Allister had been out of politics for he had been out nearly 20 years by 2004.
But he's like, well, look, have you been watching politics for the last 20 years?
No, I know, but in terms
because
the context, this guy was going to replace Ian Paisley. And the DUP had always come first in the European election. They'd always topped the poll. So because Jim Allister wouldn't have been a massively well-known, like the average Unionist wouldn't have known who Jim Allister was.
Well, I think I actually disagree with you on that, because if you take people from my parents' generation, now don't forget 20 years ago, my parents were the same age as I am now, they're in their 50s, and they knew who Jim Allister was. Jim Allister was very well known in the 1980s. Jim Allister would be somebody who was known to, at the very least, DUP supporters. So Jim Allister coming back, Jim Allister also at the criminal bar was well known. He was well known in circles as the guy that you wanted if you were up on a criminal charge. He was the guy who was at that time at the height of his game at the criminal bar. He was well known, and to bring him back from the criminal bar where he was earning hundreds of thousands of pounds, to come and get him back into politics was a coup. You might think, this was some unknown or some relatively unknown from the 80s coming back. That is not how it was. This was a name who had fallen out with the party who was coming back. This was a big name being put into the election, and everyone was very excited about it. I said, now, I didn't see how it was going to plan out, so I'm not going to give myself any credit as someone who, said this is going to be a new party and all of these things. I said I'm not overly excited about him coming back. I wouldn't be as excited as you fellas are, because I think this is a mistake. I thought it was a mistake for him to be brought back. Now, the mistake that I thought was going to happen, you've touched on it, David. Certainly Jim Allister was seen as the successor. It was Jim Allister, Peter Robinson, were the two younger members of Unionism, the DUP at that time. One of them was going to be the leader. And I thought the mistake was, and I articulated at the time, Jim Allister is not just going to sit in the benches of the European Parliament. Jim Allister will want to be more than that. You're not giving up the criminal bar to come back and be a backbencher at the European Parliament. You're coming back from the criminal bar to be a leader in this party. And my feeling was, is the 1980s going to be fulfilled where Jim Allister will be the next leader of the DUP, and therefore Peter Robinson would have been sidelined? Or is Jim Allister going to be more? I thought they were bringing back trouble. They were bringing back someone who could rival Peter Robinson strategically, in ability-wise, and how he could articulate the case. They were bringing back a rival. It was Peter Robinson who led this. It was Peter Robinson who went to Jim Allister himself and said, will you come back? So it was Peter Robinson who was orchestrating this, and I felt it was a mistake, not because of what was going to happen externally. No one could have foreseen that, but I felt you were creating for yourself an alternative power base within the party who would challenge Peter Robinson. Now, what we've seen has happen is that Jim Allister has formed a party and has become a significant thorn in the DUP side. And I do wonder if we go back to that day in Dundela Avenue, in the policy unit of the DUP, would people have had a pause for thought now and said, we shouldn't have brought him back? Because I think Jim Allister would have been quite happy to have stayed at the criminal bar at that time and been a very successful barrister, probably a judge. He would be now, rather than practicing as a barrister. So I do often wonder, and I brought this up with the people who were in the room at that time, not Peter Robinson, I've never brought it up with, but the others in the room that then have said, do you regret being the ones who bishop? Because I actually ended up working on somebody else's campaign, such as campaigning was internally in those days for Europe, for the European Parliament. I was I'd wanted Maurice Morrow actually to be the candidate. I thought he would be the better person both internally and for that role. But that's not the direction of the party. When Maurice did stand for selection that night, as did William McCrae, Lord McCrae now. He stood as well. It was the three who stood. But Jim Allister romped home. I mean, everybody else, I think Maurice got 11 or 12 votes. Willie McCrae got 5 or 6. And out of the other 90 votes, Jim Allister took them all and romped home. But then it stored up problems for the future, both internally and externally for the party.
I mean, Michael, just in terms of this here, we've actually got the amount of questions that are coming in about internal party machinations. And just going back, because obviously 2004, you guys in the SDLP didn't have an easy task either, because obviously
you stop the DUP.
You had two big beasts from Europe stepping down. So you had Paisley was stepping down, but you had John Hume stepping down too, and you guys had, unlike the DUP, had a relatively safe seat, but you guys had Sinn Féin breathing down your necks for that European seat. So do you have any memories back in 2004 when replacing John Hume and which it isn't an easy thing to do?
Yeah, well, it wasn't. But even at that time, Sinn Féin had already overtaken the SDLP, and the European seat was therefore already in danger. The Ulster Unionists, I think, held on to theirs. The SDLP one went after Hume. But just come back to Jim Allister. I mean, I take Tim's point, he's a brilliant barrister, and for the avoidance of doubt, would have made an excellent judge. But I don't think he had Peter Robinson's political strategic orientation. I think Jim is just black and white. And he's a brilliant presenter of his own arguments. He, take even the position on the inauguration of the new Irish president. The Ulster Unionists were happy to go. The DUP didn't go, but said they weren't boycotting it, even though they didn't send anybody else. But Jim Allister just said, why would any self-respecting unionist go? Why would they ever go near it, this hostile enemy state? So what you get with Jim Allister is the absolute bottom line of unionism. And I don't think he's going to go away. But having said that, and even though he's added people like Ron McDowell and Tim Gaston, who are credible TUV candidates and performers, I don't think he's built a party in the way that Peter Robinson built a big party and a big machine. And I don't think he has that kind of strategic, political, organisational brain, even though he's set up his own party. And also, he's painted himself into a corner because he's just so hardline on everything, no give whatsoever, no nuancing, and so that appeals to a certain proportion of the Unionist electorate, and it's always going to be there. But I don't see where he goes from there.
It's a pre-Anglo-Irish agreement, unionism. Yeah.
But if 2007 hadn't happened with the St Andrews Agreement, I mean, Jim Allister was much more the natural successor for Ian Paisley than Peter Robinson was.
No, he wasn't.
Whatever, but I mean, in terms of what Michael's saying, in terms of the uncompromising, he's much more in that mould. So if you were on the, for want of a better term, free Presbyterian wing of the party, Jim Allister is a free Presbyterian himself, and he would have been much more in line with your worldview than what Peter Robinson was. So that was kind of what my thinking in 2003, 2004. Like, you're setting yourself up here against another potential power base for a part of the party that never really was in love with Peter Robinson, certainly respected him, admired him, thought his strategic brain was brilliant, but never loved him. So why would you bring somebody in, and he did manage to cross a wedge in 2007 after the St Andrews Agreement, and did manage to cause internal difficulties and nearly took people with them, but didn't in the end. So why would you set that up? And that just seemed a bit of a political folly to me.
Well,
But
Jim,
a question for Michael.
Jim
is,
Wells
what-
did come eventually, though, Tim.
That's right. Well, a question for Michael is, what happened to Marty Morgan, your candidate in 2004?
I think he's dedicated himself to improving the lives of others through social work and other interactions.
So he was the SDLP candidate who replaced John Hume in the ticket.
He was former Lord Mayor of Belfast. He was seen as the next generation of the SDLP coming.
Well, he shone brightly for a while, but then he moved on to other things.
But he beat out a lot of I know people that were at that convention. He beat out a lot of experienced SDLP candidates for that.
The only thing I'd say on that was that I think he had the backing of the leadership at the time.
And why was that, Michael? Because he was the Lord Mayor of Belfast, and it suddenly emerged as, did they think it was like a bright young thing or something like that?
Yes, I think it was a bit of that. Yeah. I mean, I don't actually know the detail, but I know that I think the leadership favoured this bright, articulate young guy, thought he would capture the mood better maybe than some of the crusty old proven representatives of the past.
Because the SDLP in 2004 were looking pretty tired. Some of the figures that had been around, they weren't as old as John Hume, but they weren't massively behind him in age. They were still hanging around. Even though Mark Durkin was young.
McGuinness had a go and Alex Atwood had a go at it.
I wonder would it have been different if the rules hadn't changed in 2004 and parliamentarians were allowed to run for the European Parliament?
I think, I don't know, I kind of agree with Michael. I think Sinn Féin were always coming for that seat. Barbara de Bruyn, remember, had been the health minister. She was very high profile at the time. She was Sinn Féin's leading female politician at the time. Barbara de Bruyn has stepped away from politics since, but at that time she was the leading Sinn Féin female politician. So was Marty Morgan.
But he was this bright star, stood in the election, and then just completely disappeared.
But that's but I think that's been the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party's problem. You know, one thing. You look back at previous conferences and look back at previous videos of the two parties, these bright young things that were there 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, where are they now? They're nowhere. Sinn Féin and the DUP, I think, have done better in kind of nurturing the talent. So even when, I mean, we've talked about this before, Tim, so when things get difficult, as they were in 2022 for the DUP, there were the Philip Bretts, the Diane Forsyth, the Deborah Erskines.
There's a fair bit of talent in the SDLP at the moment. I mean, there's not many to match Claire Hanna or Matthew O'Toole.
But you think about people like Martin Morgan, Niall Kelly, people like that who were about in the party, and they're not there anymore. A lot of that talent has drifted away from the party, and not just the SDLP. The Ulster Unionists have had that problem as well. It's not.
And then we've got our secret weapon, SDF.
He will love the fact that he's been mentioned on this podcast. But just
he needs to run for. I don't think he's run for the Assembly.
He should be.
Well, the Assembly and the local government elections will be on the same day in 2027.
Will he run for the Assembly?
The SDLP will.
Fingers crossed.
Well, the SDLP will be foolish and will run too, even though they've only got one seat in South Belfast. But
do you think? Here's an interesting question. One maybe to think about for a different pod. But if Seamus DeFletcher was to run in South Belfast, would that put Matthew O'Toole under pressure or not?
Stop that, you.
No. I mean, why wouldn't you?
Because he's very popular.
But when you look at Claire Hanna's performance in South Belfast, there's a big vote to chase there.
Michael,
it mightn't all transfer to SDLP.
It is not an SDLP vote. It's a Claire Hanna vote. That is not for the SDLP.
But wouldn't you? Would you not be a bit defeatist if you didn't run too?
How do you grow? How does the SDLP grow if they run to South Belfast?
Here's the thing.
Hope they're not going to take their advice from you.
Here's the thing. First of all, there are not two seats in South Belfast for the SDLP at the minute. I know that. We all know that. Everyone else knows it. So they're going to run Matthew, and they're going to run someone who nobody knows along with him, right? Who will get probably about 1,000 votes if they're lucky. What the SDLP need to show momentum, and again, they can learn from the Alliance Party on this, is on the BBC election ticker. I always think, if you're a party, what do you want on the BBC election ticker? What do you want that panel to be talking about? I think Leader of the Opposition tops the poll in South Belfast is a better talking point, running one, than running two and Matthew getting in on count five. I just think that's a better talking point.
Well, I take my hat off to you guys. You know what the electorate's going to do in the next election.
I agree with Michael.
But
I
if I'm a
wholeheartedly agree with
political
Michael.
party in a strong constituency, I think I'll try
If
to.
the SDLP want to grow, they've got to take 2 in South Belfast.
Yeah,
they don't
that's what
run
I'm
2 in
saying.
South Belfast. They may as well pack up and go home. Where your MP is weighing the votes, and to take your point, David,
That's what
that is
I'm
a Claire
saying.
Hanna vote. She's weighing the votes, and yes, it's
Tim,
her personal vote, but she needs to convert that personal vote to an SDLP vote. That's leadership.
Yeah, but she's not on the. Claire Hanna in 2019 took 57% of the vote. The SDLP vote at the 2022 Assembly election in South Belfast was 16%.
You're
There
such
is
a
not 2
defeatist.
seats there.
You're such a defeatist.
There's not 2
She
seats
needs
there.
to convert that
3 years have
57%.
passed since then,
Anna, look,
and Claire is now the leader of the party.
lads,
Well,
lads,
I'll tell you what, all I'll say
her
to the
magic won't spread?
SDLP is they'd be better employing me as an electoral strategist than you do.
No, because you would have advised the DUP, just while you're not working for the DUP, because you would have had them running too in South Belfast in 2022, and they probably would have ended up with no seat if they had ran
I think you're a bit of BBC ticker tape on election day reads better if SDLP gain seats in South Belfast. Even if they both come in on the last count.
They're far better. They're far better focusing their attention in places like West Belfast, where they can gain an assembly seat instead of running 2. Look, Matthew O'Toole top in the poll, as the same with Anna Lowe. When she ran by herself, no one talked about. She was only the same thing with Deirdre Hargey when she topped the poll, ran by herself. Who was talking about that she had no running mate? It was Deirdre Hargey topped the poll. That was what was on the thing. Leader of opposition tops the poll in on count 1. Is a far better talking point.
The SDLP leave 30% of the electorate from the Westminster election on the table for other parties. There's your story.
It's already happening, Tim. This is already a dynamic. So
not even 30, but maybe 40%.
Anyway, look, we'll come back.
We'll agree to differ.
We'll agree to differ. We will come back.
We'll come back to this, no doubt.
We're going to come back to this. We've got just over 17 months to go until the next assembly election. There are quite a few comments that are derogatory about Tim. So to show I'm not picking on him, we're going to move on to our next topic. But thank you so much to everyone who is messaged in. We do read them all. It may take us a bit of time to get to them, but we do genuinely appreciate those people who do. And just to remind you of how you can get in touch with us, WhatsApp us on 0333 404 6507. Remember to use the word Stormont. Also drop us an email, hello@stormontsources.com. Engage with us on social media. Let us know what you're thinking, and we will get to you eventually. So thank you very much for all that. And we'll move on to our next topic. Welcome back to Stormont Sources. Tempers were fraught at Stormont this week as Paul Givan fended off a vote of no confidence. The debate in the chamber was at many times personal, and the relationship between the executive parties is clearly not good. The toxic Thunderdome, as the Dairy Minister called it, was on full show on Monday. This goes alongside the DUP sending nobody to the presidential inauguration of Catherine Connolly, and this is despite Peter Robinson going to the inauguration of Michael D. Higgins on the same day in 2011. So we're asking, are we on a fast track toward an executive collapse? And can anything be done to potentially avoid that? Michael, what did you make of what you saw this week?
No, we're not. No. The debate, the Paul Givan debate, was entirely predictable, entirely tribal. He himself revels in that sort of stuff and loved having to respond to it all. As we knew from the pod last week when he graced us with his presence. I think the executive's in a bad place. There's no doubt, but whose interest would be served in collapsing it? No one. In fact, they get the blame, and that would cost them at the next election. So they will trundle into the next election. Now, there could be some tactical thing as you approach the next election. Let's say 2 months out, that they can manufacture a big argument and collapse it then just before the election. So they go into the election on the basis of the big argument they've just had, and that'll polarise opinion, and that might suit people on the the DUP and Sinn Féin in particular, and TV maybe. So they could do that tactically near the election. But the idea that because relations are so poor, or because their performance is so poor, that they'll collapse it now, no chance whatsoever, because it's in no one's interest. But you couldn't underestimate the difficulties they're facing. The relations aren't good in the executive office, and if you look at any department, they have problems that they cannot fix, that they're finding it even difficult to address. And I mean all the departments. Obviously, health waiting list is enormous. Even the Department of the Economy, the climate targets are going nowhere. Department of not social communities, the housing's a debacle. Even finance, one of the tough guy negotiators, John O'Dowd, he seems to have hit a brick wall negotiating with the Treasury on extra money. Dara, the minister's making great noises, but he's got Loch Ness and he's got nowhere to go because they won't let him move on any of this environmental stuff. And eventually the speeches cease to have meaning. Naomi Long's gone nowhere in justice. There's no money to pay the police. There's no money to pay the IT revelation compensation. Everywhere you look, infrastructure, the A5, Paul Given's wrapped up in all sorts of controversies in education. Maybe he's trying to do too much, actually. But everywhere you go, even though the individual ministers may well be trying hard, they are facing intractable problems. And for some of them, the collapse of the institution might be a release, a merciful release. But it's not going to happen because it's not in anybody's interest.
Okay, Timothy, what do you think?
Well, I've always been much more pessimistic than you two.
Yeah, we were.
This,
Now we were giving it. You were giving it a 9 out of 10 that it would stay up. Michael, I was 8, and you were a 6 out of 10. Tim.
Yeah, and I think maybe even 6. I was reflecting on this. I was talking to somebody last week after the podcast who thought I was too optimistic. They were giving it a 3 or a 4. So I thought maybe 3 was a little pessimistic. I've always been much more pessimistic than you two. I think things are fairly volatile.
Why is that though, Tim? So from my perspective, from what I can see, my totally balanced perspective, I think the pressure seems to be within the DUP in particular at the minute. That seems to be the most.
I think there's pressure in Sinn Féin as well.
No. So I'm going to come to Sinn. So it seems to be within the DUP, in terms of how unsettled that picture is, because Gavin, 18 months into his leadership, still is not, and we've talked about this challenge and we'll unpack this in a bit, it's still not cutting through in the way he probably needs to cut through and vis-a-vis Jim Allister in that battle. And then you've got the Alliance Party as well, who are kind of dipping, and I think that sense is there that the party is dipping. And there is a bit of frustration, although I don't think to the same degree within Sinn Féin. But again, those two frictions pile off each other between Sinn Féin and the DUP. You know, the two feed off each other. So go.
Well, I think there's grassroots discontent on both sides. I don't think Sinn Féin are where they're at, you know, sort of post RHI and post the Leafa decision and all of that, where, you know, they had that meeting on the Saturday morning, and the feeling from the grassroots was this has to go, this has to be pulled down, Martin McGuinness has to pull it down. I don't think they're there yet, but I think that discontent, that rumbling, is murmuring below the surface in Sinn Féin, and it's certainly murmuring below the surface within Unionism as well. There is a grassroots, ordinary Unionists don't feel like Stormont's really working for them. Ordinary grassroots Republicans and Nationalists don't really feel like Stormont's working for them. So how can you go to the electorate in 17 months' time and say, this is working for you, we're brilliant, give us your vote, here's our manifesto, when there's this murmur, rumbling of discontent below the surface? And I think if that noise starts to get louder, more decisions in Irish language, more blocking of Casement Park, if those things start to rumble amongst the grassroots, I can see very quickly that this could escalate into a crisis, and it will happen, and it will happen fast if it's going to be brought down. And I can see that. I feel like the rumblings are starting to get louder on both sides. There are people who would be nationalist Republicans who I've spoken to in the last couple of weeks who have said to me they are feeling within that community a growing discontent. And I can tell you from the Unionist perspective, I am feeling a growing discontent. That can bubble up very quickly and could pull
I agree with that in that I am detecting here a nationalist discontent, Republican discontent as well. But and I have no reason to doubt that what Tim says right there on the Union side. But I don't think you can bring it down and just say, well, the reason I'm bringing it down is we're kind of just fed up with it all. We're just fed up because A, that's not a good enough excuse, and B, that actually presents for the first time nearly 20 years an opening for the other parties for the Ulster Unionist Party, SDLP, Alliance to come along and say, well, you've had 20 years of these guys, they're fed up. They keep tumbling the institutions. Why don't you look elsewhere? Why don't you think, give us a chance? You threw us out 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Give us another go.
Interesting, Michael.
So I don't think they'll do it. I don't think there's any danger of them collapsing unless there's a better reason than we're fed up.
But interesting, Michael. I was on, again, maybe I shouldn't plug a rival podcast, but I will anyway. It was the Red Lions podcast 2 weeks ago. It was...
a fantastic production.
A fantastic production, and I thought
today's episode's going to be
I thought the
even
contributions were okay from all concerned. But we were talking about the Alliance Party, right? And I was just reflecting after it, and I thought, if Alliance were in opposition, and as the mood has gradually deteriorated over the past 3-4 months, if Alliance were there and they had their 17 seats, what would they be doing now? Because can you imagine Naomi Long with that demand better, and she's just totally clean and totally outside the executive. I mean, Alliance could be doing some serious polling numbers right now, because you think about it, Alliance, well, one of the tricks with Alliance, Michael, and the SDLP has suffered as a result of this, is that they're not toxic to nationalists anymore. They are a home now that nationalists can go to. Same for Unionists, despite the fact, I think there's a certain type of Unionists that'll never go to Alliance, but a lot of Unionists do go to Alliance, and no matter how much the DUP and the Ulster Unionists try to stop that, but they have moved. I mean, could we be looking at...
Paul Given called them a left-wing nationalist party.
I know, Jay, but it's nonsense. But
I agree with Paul.
But I just wonder, but I do just wonder, would we be looking at Alliance today on 18, 19, 20% of the vote if they were outside, or is that just wishful thinking?
I was interested in the comments actually of David Ford in that podcast. He seemed to be suggesting that the Alliance Party wouldn't set themselves up as opposition. Maybe I was mishearing him. You were kind of tackling him and with a bit of surprise on that, because David Ford would seem to be suggesting that Alliance just had to go in to,
which they don't, which is ridiculous, because they don't have. Yeah.
If I was the Alliance Party, I would say, well, we're not going to be Justice Minister. If either the Justice Ministry is a normal to hunt ministry, because we're not going to be the patsies to keep this up, and we're going to take the ministries we're entitled to, but we're not, you fellas need to sort this out, DUP and Sinn Féin, in terms of what's happening around justice, because we're not going to prop this up anymore. That's what I'd be saying. If I was Alliance, I wouldn't be seen as the party that's trying to hold the two warring sides together, because I think that's doing Alliance harm currently in the polls. I think it makes it much easier for the SDLP, Sinn Féin to attack Alliance, for the DUP, also Unionist to attack Alliance, and I think that's why Alliance has been put under pressure. So I was quite surprised at what David Ford was articulating. He seemed to be saying, look, Alliance just needs to plod on as it is. But I agree with you, David. Alliance needs to do better at maybe seizing on the rise on both sides, but it can't do that whilst it's in the position it's in the executive.
And in particular, when their ministers aren't really making any noticeable difference to anything.
Yeah, and this is because David Ford on that podcast was talking about prison reform, and I was just like, no one's voting on prison reform. Nobody is. You can understand why Alliance went in previously, because it did give them a relevance that I know a bit of a sore point for you, Michael, because they took a portfolio that the SDLP were entitled to in 2010, but.
That's politics.
It's politics, but anyway, I can understand why they went in previously, because it did give them a relevance that they just had never, ever, ever had before. I just don't know if it does now. I just think for the mandate that they got in 2022, that demand better mandate, and it was just people who were just fed up with the system. They just didn't see the SDLP or the Ulster Unionists as credible vehicles to protest that. I just think it's just a misunderstanding of their mandate, I think.
One thing Naomi Long has done is shown that the Justice Ministry is not that important, because there's this idea of justice is so important. It's this crucial ministry. It has its tentacles everywhere. I mean, the DUP pulled this amazing contract for a long time that finance ministry was something that was worthwhile, and it was a complete contract, and it's been shown to be so. The finance ministry isn't worth very much. I mean, economy is the most important ministry, and I think Naomi Long has shown, and I'm not saying, I don't want this to sound like a criticism of Naomi Long. It's not. There's nothing very much that you can do of crucial significance within justice. You give the police their money, and as she quite rightly says, and gets criticised for this, but she's right. She gets asked a question about the police. Well, I can't do anything on operational matters. That's for the chief constable. You ask those questions to the policing board, and I do feel sorry for her in that.
But on other big high-profile stuff, like all this legacy stuff, she's a bystander. I mean, it's all Britain and Ireland and London
across
and
the water.
Dublin.
Legacy. Yeah, that's exactly.
I
it.
mean,
Michael,
the Justice Minister it appears has very little involvement in it.
You decide what
If
money
I
the
was
police are
advising
going to
the
get.
lads,
You decide what money the prisons are going to get.
I would say them get into opposition, but they need an excuse to break into opposition. And the excuse might be they bring all the Andrew Muir environmental Loch Ness, Sea of Loch Ness stuff to a head, and Naomi says, if you don't back his proposals, we're out of here. And they get out, and overnight she becomes the leader of the opposition. And suddenly, and maybe the Ulster Unionists might follow, and suddenly you get a proposition where they're nearly daring the DUP and Sinn Féin to bring it down.
Well,
and leaving them to govern.
There is no hope of Mike Nesbitt leaving the Department of Health. The only way Mike Nesbitt's leaving the Department of Health is on May 7th. Is on the 7th of May 2027. That's when Mike Nesbitt's leaving the Department.
January's not far away when he's going to take this much heralded decision on his future.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I just think the Alliance have just fundamentally misread their mandate from 2022. That mandate, I appreciate there's a core section of Alliance that wants to make it work. And Alliance has always been that kind of constructive, all the way from Sunningdale right the way through. They've always been that kind of constructive force. But where I dispute with David Ford and many people in the Alliance Party is that opposition can be constructive. You know, opposition in a democracy can be a constructive thing. It doesn't need to be destructive.
It is, but you can't get anything done if you're in opposition. Like,
no, totally.
You come into politics.
No, I get that. It's just more. I think it's also the thing that we bring home is that the executive is really run by the DP and Sinn Féin. That's who runs the executive. They decide the agenda. They decide where the money goes. People like Tim were in rooms trying to screw people like you over Michael. And the big failure of the UUP and the SDLP over that time was how long they sat there.
And the fiction, and I think the executive should just be the two largest parties, the largest party from nationalism, largest party from unionism, and let them get on with it. But I think coupled with that, you know, there needs to be the opposition needs to have more money and better resources.
It does. No, it
to
does.
be able to hold the executive to account.
Yeah, it does. And there needs to be more. Like, we do the fiction. Like, Matthew O'Toole is treated like someone. I was watching it this week. Is treated like someone. He's just a regular MLA. He gets one question. He gets a supplementary, and he gets called for. But the opposition leader should have more questions.
The opposite. So if there was, you know, the opposition leader should, you know, leaders should have, like, say 6 questions. To all ministers, and then if there's more than there's a leader and a deputy leader, that should be divided 3 and 3.
And the physical layout of the assembly chamber should change. The DUP and Sinn Féin face each other as though they're still fighting the battle against each other. Whereas they're on the same side. Meanwhile, the opposition's in the corner.
No, they should.
Right. The executive party should be down one side, horseshoeing round.
And Matthew should be facing the first and deputy first minister all the time.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, that there should be like 6 questions for the opposition, and then, you know, they can decide. You know, so if there's 2 parties, Ulster Unionist and SDLP and Alliance, we can yield to another party and say they're going to get all 6 questions, and then they can go, and then you can mix and match and have a bit more strategy.
And force the opposition to come together as well. And there was the start. This is before Tim, your actions helped bring it down in 2017. There were signs of that because the UUP and the SDLP were cooperating on opposition motions. They were signing joint motions. They were starting to do that in 2016, but it just didn't. They just didn't get the time to do it, which was a shame. But I do think opposition earned their spurs with, and I'm not trying to trigger you here, Tim, with the RHI issue. I think the opposition turning up the heat on the executive, I think was critical in where we got to on that.
The Nolan show was critical. It wasn't.
Well, it wasn't just the opposition, but
I was able to say, if it wasn't for Stephen Nolan, none of that would have happened. Yes, we had the spotlight program, and it started, and then Stephen Nolan just took it, and he was like a dog with a bone. He wasn't let go of it, and he's the part. He was the opposition.
Per Sam McBride, written out of history.
But I mean, in those initial periods, I mean, take Sam McBride's book. Sam McBride's book for many people is the RHI report, not what came out of RHI. So, you know, journalists did do an important job at that time, but it was really, I feel Stephen Nolan was more critical than what.
Tell the truth. Should the heavens fall?
Well, I think
how many times times did you pray, Tim, before you went on and talked?
The saying every day, David. The saying, I think Jonathan got it wrong, wasn't it? It was. He said, "Let justice be done," where the biblical saying is let. Well, no, let truth be spoken. Where he said, "Let justice be done," or the other way round.
Right. Okay.
I can't remember. Now Michael's got my biblical knowledge all.
Let's get away from.
And I'm gonna get absolutely pasted by William Crawley.
Let's get away from spiritual sources here. But back to, so obviously another thing that happened this week was obviously the presidential inauguration of Catherine Connolly, and I know Tim doesn't like talking about the politics of this of the rest of this island, but obviously the DUP made the decision not to send anybody down. The Ulster Unionist did. Steve Aiken went down. A parliamentary party of 31 people. Now, Emma couldn't go in. Emma, to be fair to her, I think, and I will say this, and I did get a wee bit of stick on Twitter, X, for actually kind of semi-defending Emma, because, you know, going to Windsor for Remembrance Day, that is something you can, I think that's an acceptable thing for a Unionist First Minister, a Deputy First Minister, sorry, to go and do, and you can understand why she would do that. But the fact that so that's 30. So that's down to 30. None of the other 30 could go down. I mean, Tim and Gavin said it's not a snub, but it's a snub, isn't it?
Well, I was just glad that Olympic swimming hero Michelle Smith was able to be there to represent the people of Northern Ireland. I mean that.
Catherine... she was later discredited over drugs testing and so on.
Well, I think that's disputed, so we'll maybe leave that one there for legal reasons.
So, if we can get back to the actual politics, so Catherine Connolly, the new president, in her speech made reference to Michelle Smith when she meant Michelle O'Neill,
who is an Olympic swimmer from Atlanta, who won a bucket load of gold medals for Ireland.
Very, very fast swimmer.
She was Ireland's only Olympic gold swimming medalist, I think, in the history of the Olympics. Is that right, David? Maybe you could
Can we get back to the presidential inauguration, please? Go.
Well, it was just good to hear her mentioned as representing Northern Ireland at the presidential inauguration. That was great. It was so good that Michelle Smith had worked so hard for the president to get her elected and given that party endorsement to her. And I was just warmed by that. I really was. I didn't understand the rest of the Irish, but I suppose
you better provide the context that Catherine Connolly mistakenly referred to Michelle O'Neill as Michelle Smith during her speech.
And what was beautiful was it was during the part when she was speaking in Irish as well. So for all of us, we didn't know anything else.
Well, that's too. He had to say, because remember when the King first came here, he made a bit of an idiot out of Jeffrey Donaldson whenever he walked up to Michelle O'Neill. Was like, "Oh, you're the leader of the largest party now."
I knew you from somewhere.
And Jeffrey standing beside her, and now Catherine Connolly, the new head of state.
Go on, David. Do your impression of the King.
I've done it. But I think it's interesting. Two heads of state embarrassing two different people respectively, as well. But Tim, took us 6 minutes to get back to the question. Was it a mistake?
Well, I think go, don't go. I think very much. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Well, look, I'm on record and sort of saying that the DUP should have sent somebody to go. And I think I said on Talkback the other day that the person I would have sent was Paul Gibbon. I mean, that would have been just a
Imagine if she got Paul Gibbon's name right, or Emma Pengelly's name right, and Michelle's wrong.
And Michelle Smith's wrong, I know. It would have
been. Paul Gibbon is, after all, a senior minister.
And he's the next most senior person after Emma Pengelly.
Yeah,
and if they had have sent Paul to the inauguration, I think, given the context of Monday, given the context of the last week, given the context of her views on Palestine, which are very much on the record, I think they've sent Paul Gibbon there. No one could have complained about it, but it would have been just a beautiful moment for Twitter, and a beautiful moment of Unionists thinking strategically, not thinking for today but for tomorrow and the next day. So I think it would have really emboldened the DUP electorate to have seen that. I think people would have enjoyed that. Would have people would have got the significance of that, and no one could have complained about it. That would have been playing 3D chess for the DUP, and
that would have been quite a little stroke.
Your thoughts on the DUP. Snubbing, not snubbing?
Well, if you don't send anybody, you are snubbing it, I suppose. But, I mean, Gavin and Emma had perfectly reasonable reasons to not be there and to be elsewhere. Funny, I was at a thing last night, and Edmund Poots was at it. He turned down the invitation too, although that was an evening thing. But no, as I said earlier, 3 different kinds of unions parties, 3 different responses. Ulster Unionist Party, happy to go. DUP, saying they're not snubbing, but effectively snubbing. And then TUV, why would any self-respecting unionist ever go near it? Foreign, hostile leader of a hostile
I'm surprised,
state.
David, you haven't mentioned that I basically call part of like the BBC Pan-Nationalist Front on top.
I love that. Jim Allister's excellent value for money all the time.
And then I scurried away to just agreed with everything Jim said for the rest of the segment.
You were too busy. You were too busy running for cover. You're a bit, you can take the boy out of the DUP, but you can't take the DUP out of the boy running for cover.
I think I said about 15 times. Somebody said to me afterwards, how many times are you going to say Jim Allister was right?
You picked with the Paul Given should go and the 3D chess. That was good. But then it was, yes, Jim, whatever you like.
And Jim's right. Jim's right.
But there are people who've got the measure of Jim, and there are certain young ladies they've figured out how to get up his nose.
Okay, how do you do that?
One is Saoirse Eastwood, and the other was the journalist who was on with you, Aoife Moore.
Well, how do you get up Jim Allister's nose?
The way to really just... I can imagine the smoke coming out of his ears, but the way to really just upset him when he's in full flow is to suggest that he doesn't understand something. Saoirse Eastwood says, well, Jim just doesn't understand it. Jim doesn't realise. There's a beautiful
moment Aoife Moore said, well, you'd know this if you read my book, Jim. And he said, I better things to do on my time.
That's.
And then I was scurrying and going, Jim's right. You know, well here, you're like the DUP leadership basically now. So you are. So, but Tim, I want to end on this because we've spoken about this before about the DUP being under threat, and that decision just smacked me of Gavin just feeling under threat and under pressure. And you know, I think that if the DUP were on 24% in the polls, I think Gavin would have made a different decision. I cannot conceivably believe that Gavin thinks that in a rational moment you send nobody to the presidential inauguration. I think he knows that that's a nonsense, and yet he went ahead and did it. But I think that's because he's under threat. DUP's under threat. I think the DUP election campaign's set. It's the seats we have we're going to hold, and we'll try and get a bit of growth in North Antrim, maybe run somebody in West Belfast if there's a possibility of taking a Unionist seat there. Probably not anyway, in the same way as there was in the past, a chance for that. So I think, you know, the growth strategy of the DUP is going to be limited as it was in 2022, and it's simply going to be the seats we've got, we're just going to hold on to them, and we'll maybe nick one in North Antrim.
And we've got plenty of time to debate if that doesn't work, because that's a continuation of the Jeffrey
Well, it worked
Donaldson.
in 2022, and I was critical of it in 2022. I think my tweet was read out on election night when you were in the studio, David.
But though, Tim, you have to say, though, the DUP had big margins in those seats.
There are a lot of fat,
and they're
gone.
Could be trimmed, that's gone
and the
now.
fat has been trimmed,
so they were copping 7, 8, 9% swings and holding the 2 seats, and that's gone now. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes. Look, gents, thank you very much for going around. Much more sedate podcast this week, which is good. At least we're not like Stormont.
Before we go, of course, we should say, good luck to Northern Ireland at the weekend. I'm heading over, and people can obviously come up to me in Cossack, and we can have a chat about the podcast as we did when we're in Cologne. So
okay. Tim's got a lot of time on his hands.
People can come up and tell me.
Who are they playing?
In Northern Ireland, we're playing Slovakia in Cossack on Friday night, and I will be there, and people come up and tell me what they think of David and Michael, like they did the last one.
It'll be a tougher game. The last game against Slovakia, I think, was Northern Ireland's best performance in about 20 years. And Bradley was incredible.
Right, okay.
But there's a great moment, I have to tell you this, where this guy taps me on the shoulder, and he says, "Oh, I love your podcast," and all that. And I thought, well, I'm on home territory here. I'll start to slag off David and Michael. So I started to slag you two off, and he was going, "Oh, no, I like them. They're good. They're good." I was like, "Okay, the one Northern Ireland fan that likes a match."
That has never happened with you, Tim, in reverse, by the way. Normally slagging you off is how the conversation starts. shorts.
You need to get over your wee North Belfast bubble.
Right, gents, thank you so much for going around the house to get the podcast ended eventually. Thanks very much to Tim. Thanks, Michael. And thank you for joining us on the Stormont Sources podcast. Remember, you drop us a WhatsApp, 0333 404 6507. Also drop us an email, hello@stormontsources.com. That's all we have time for this episode. We'll see you again next week.